Greetings, one and all. I would like to welcome you to the 13th edition of the Best Practice Meet. It gives me great honor to host this session, and this session is about zero trust, no trust. Well, to talk about zero trust is not a new concept. However, for today's concept, we can sort of define zero trust as products and services that can create an identity and context-based logical access boundary that encompasses a user in an application or a set of applications. The applications are hidden from discovery and access is restricted via a trust broker to a collection of named entities. I know these are big jargons to simplify it. Basically, an person or an entity or a device will not be trusted unless verified. Right? That is the concept of zero trust, no trust. Right. The session will touch upon facets such as architectural shift, engineering of point solutions, and enterprise security approaches. Now, I would like to call upon stage the moderator for the session, Mr. Rajesh. Hi, Mr. Rajesh. Mr. Rajesh Thapar is the CISO of Axis Bank. I'll now like to introduce the panel. I'd like to call up Mr. Agni Dipta first. Welcome, Mr. Agni. Mr. Agni Dipta Sarkar is the Group CISO for Biocoin. Next, may I have Mr. Andy on stage? Hi, Mr. Andy, welcome. Mr. Andy Young is the Security Solutions Architect for Keysight. And finally, we have Mr. Prakash. Welcome, Mr. Prakash. Mr. Prakash Padaria is a CISO at PayU. Mr. Rajesh, may I request you to share your opening remarks and initiate the panel discussion? Over to you.
Thanks, Anand. Good afternoon, everybody. On the zero trust, primarily, we will go through some of those key learnings which industry has picked up at large, what industry at the OEM ecosystem is doing, and end of the session, we'll take some of the questions as well. So, security has always been on this word of trust. I mean, primarily, this is not a new term, zero trust, while zero trust coined out in a particular way, but untrusted network, trusted users is something we have been hearing for years now. I mean, say 15 years back, we used to have untrusted network. Even today, we have DMZ segregated from a trusted and untrusted network. So that trust has been a key element of information security. We always had trusted insiders and untrusted outsiders. So again, that trust used to be there in the element of our control formation and all that stuff. But this model, which started its evolution way back about 14-15 years back in some or the other form and got crystallized once Forrester coined it as a zero trust framework, has some of the elements which gets embedded more from operations, process, tools, solutioning perspective. And it's not one tool or one thing that can make a zero trust implementation. It's a journey which is a combination of various things that we would be requiring to do. Industry at large is working on both sides, the consumers of this particular framework as well as the providers of this framework. Both are working at large to ensure that we have significant control frameworks in place, to ensure that we have our risk surfaces reduced. And this is zero trust framework is in fact on those lines, which helps to minimize, to a best effort basis, minimize the attack surface. So with that context, I would like to invite Mr. Andy Young for the first question. Mr. Andy, at large, what is it that you have seen are the challenges which the zero trust is actually getting solved in the industry at large, and how is it how is that the ground rules of security implementation are changing? I mean, with the zero trust coming in across the sectors.
Thank you. Yeah, so well, in terms of the current mindset, of course, you've touched on the fact that security has changed over the years. It's improved with technology, but until now, the approach has always been about securing the perimeter, and so in terms of the ground rules, well, the perimeter secures the internal trusted network, and users are on that trusted network. Anything external is untrusted. Whether that's a device or a person or data, it's safe, it's trusted, and if it's explicitly trusted, then potentially all users and devices can have access to all data and users' devices on the network. And modern thinking is that that's a slightly flawed approach. As we push services out to the cloud and adopt that technology, the perimeter gets pushed out as well, which is not greatly flexible. I mean, that's not to say that perimeter isn't still important, but again, to your point, it's all about the trust. So where you have a model where everything internal on your network is trusted, then you typically don't bother logging or monitoring, and that then means you don't have any visibility of any of the indicators of compromise. So you don't actually know if you've been breached. And zero trust is that strategic kind of approach where it brings together all those best practices as you mentioned, and I always call it that assume breach mindset. So I think the the ground rules now are based on the assumption that you are in an untrusted network, even on your own network. So everybody has to authenticate, whether that's devices with API keys or whether it's multi-factor authentication for users. And I think the big complication, probably the most complicated aspect of this is because we now have to worry about the data and this, in this assume breach mindset. The complication is understanding really what infrastructure we have, what's our security posture, understanding what data we have, and what workflows use that data. So I think probably the most complicated aspect that I've seen is actually getting a good understanding of what assets you have and what interactions you have on your network, so that you can make sure that nothing goes out of those boundaries.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. So, Mr. Agni, primarily in a context which comes from a service provider on the Zero Trust network, and from you as a practitioner or as a group CISO of Biocon, what, according to you, are those threat landscape evolutions or the dynamic threat landscape which is actually making a driver for the Zero Trust adoption? I mean, what are the things that are happening in enterprises at large and maybe various sectors cut across, which actually helps the organization see that this is a ray of hope? And also in the same question, I probably also want to get your view that is this yet another hype, or is it something which is worth the efforts?
So this whole zero trust thing has been around for 10 years, a little more than 10 years. This is the 11th year. 2010 is when it first came up with. Now, we've been hearing about zero trust for about 2.5 years, right? It's when it really picked up. What really has happened is, in the security industry, and I'm sure this is true with all industries, there comes a time when you can't keep selling the same thing over and over again. You need innovation. And zero trust became the vehicle for that innovation. Now, the state today is that it is both a hype and a reality. There are a lot of people who have come with zero trust as a keyword, just like they put artificial intelligence, machine learning, all these buzzwords people put in their products, and they will come and tell you this is zero trust in some way or the other, which is good, which is also bad, because if you're not able to filter the noise from reality, then you have a problem. But while having said that, there is a reality that you cannot deny, and that reality is that connectivity has become ubiquitous, right? You should be able to gain access to your business data no matter where you are, and it should be immediately available. That's the business demand, whether you are in telecom, finance, marketing, pharma, healthcare, anywhere. And there are a lot of strides that the industry is making to reach there. Cloud services have come up. So all these things boil down to the basic question: do I trust the person who I cannot see but is on a wire and is connecting to my IT infrastructure? Now, earlier, the whole concept was very simple. Like, you know what Andy said, there was a perimeter that defined what is inside is trusted, what is outside is not trusted. Today, we are talking about perimeter-less security, which means you have to now understand that the perimeter would be around your data. So earlier the zero trust was at the perimeter. Now the perimeter is inside, it is into your data, it is into your identity. So that is where zero trust has gone. It's a great ray of hope. There is that concept of making sure that you trust someone only when you are able to verify that explicitly and provide access through least privilege is the hallmark of zero trust, and that should be there for every application that an enterprise provides to its users and to outsiders. So, to answer your first question, yes, there is a great ray of hope there, and of course, it is also hype because there are a lot of people who are coming up with their own view about what zero trust is. You may or may not agree with that. But on the other side, it's to answer the second question, is it is a great ray of hope. I have seen startups who are coming out with products which can completely hide your infrastructure from someone who's trying to access it. They're calling that as zero trust. Yeah, some very exciting work is happening. So, to be fair, zero trust is a concept. It doesn't need to be a product. It doesn't need to be uh, a technology. You can do zero trust in your procedures as well. And at the end of the day, it's a thematic way of doing security.
Yeah, well put, sir. Well put, sir. Thanks. So, Mr. Prakash, see, organizations have invested over the years. I mean, as Agni was also mentioning, that over the years, zero trust had been existing, but irrespective of zero trust or no zero trust, all of us had put in a tech stacks, security controls, and there is a way we were handling or mitigating the risks that we were seeing. With this zero trust thing coming up and the partner ecosystem evolving and projecting out the set of solutions for everything, posing either rightly or wrongly, whatever that is, leave that apart, but they are coming up and saying everything is zero trust, and that there comes the question of where do we want to, how do we want to strategize on optimally using our existing infrastructure and the solutions and the controls that we have enforced without really going all hog on one, and how do you create that strategy or a balance between what you have and where you want to be? So what's your view on that?
Yeah. So thank you, Rajesh. I completely agree with Agni what he said. It's probably a new terminology. I wouldn't say the buzzword. If you look at the NIST guideline, it kind of picked up in 2020 when the NIST released a draft on a standard called 207, and that's where probably it's probably the solution provider started using that word as soon as the all the quadrant rankings have started picking up. Uh, like Agni said, this has been there for a long time. If I could relate to the older technology, consider a normal VLAN segmentation. It's nothing but a zero trust, right? It's been there from the day when switches and routers arrived in the world, right? It's more granular now, more to do with macro controls, more to do with segmentation at a macro level. Those were the days when we used to segregate between VLANs with IP addresses and subnets. Now it has done a deep dive at a user level, as a device identity level, like a MAC address level, right? The new concept what has come up in this one is authenticate and authorize everyone, right? It was not the case earlier because VLAN doesn't have that many functionalities on different OSI layers to authenticate all the layers. There are few layers which get missed out in the whole VLANing concept. And probably a new concept which is more to do with don't trust anybody in your network, right? Not even your own. If you have different segmentation, don't even trust each other within your own company. So these are the new solutions which is coming up in a terminology, what we call it as ZTNA. Like Agni said, lots of fantastic innovations happening. Everybody has its own terminology of presenting zero trust in some way or either. I would love to share probably the good architectures, what is there out there, probably in the next segment of questions.
Okay, fair. So, Agni, primarily with all what we have gathered and discussed till now, while it looks to be, yes, and you said it right, it's a ray of hope, which people can go with that optimism and maybe enhance the level of controls around what we are putting, whether technical, process level, or whatever controls we do. But there would definitely be challenges with going with something like this. What, according to you, are the on the flip side of it? One should be cautious. What should be the readiness checks that I should have in mind before an enterprise thinks of going that journey, right? And what sort of challenges they foresee they will receive, and is there a way to proactively be prepared for handling those challenges which may come their way?
That's a great thing, because while the concept of zero trust is quite heartening, the reality is when you get down to brass tacks, it's a very big thing. Because as you said, organizations have already invested into technologies and there are protections already in place. Moving away from those protections and investing into zero trust will remain a challenge, for two reasons, actually for three reasons. The first reason is that with the innovation comes the element of cost. So every time you talk to somebody who is new, who's bringing in a new concept, like Prakash talked about segmentation and micro segmentation. Micro segmentation tools are horribly costly. I mean, they probably deserve that cost. I'm not denying that, but they're costly. So think about, buying a micro segmentation tool. When you are doing some level of segmentation, you are unable to justify the delta versus the amount of investments that you are making. So that's the first problem, the cost of new technology, right? The second problem is operational, and which is easier solved than the expense part of it. Because if your processes are aligned to the concept of zero trust, you probably are more prepared to adopt a zero trust model than otherwise. So, cultural issues come forward when you look at these things, right? So, I don't know how many of you have faced, but once you tell a senior leaders in an organization that earlier you were trusted, now you are not, it creates a totally different perception of what security is doing. It is like, I don't know what you guys are doing. It's not making sense. So that's the second aspect of doing this. And the third aspect, which is a huge challenge, is not operational and not the cost of technology either. It is that there are related systems, there are dependencies. One of the things that come on our tables as CISOs is planning ahead of looking at dependencies. So you're planning to replace, for example, a very simple example. Let's say you have a multi-factor authentication system in place. Now you're trying to replace the existing multi-factor, which also has some element of zero trust in it, with a zero trust model where you're going to validate other factors like your MAC address, your location, and so on and so forth. Now, when you start doing that, then you have a dependency of whether the application, if you're trying to marry it to an application, then that application should be ready to accept that change. The application vendor should be ready to, incorporate that. The people who are using that application or putting data in, they should be okay to be, thrown out if they are not able to be validated. And then there are false positives which will happen, right? You may find that someone's using a VPN connection initially, and suddenly in the morning he was connecting from Bangalore. In 2 seconds, he suddenly started connecting from Bombay. That might be treated as a violation of zero trust, and you might be thrown out. So I think these three things, if you consider, they totally fill up that whole picture.
So, Agni, a follow-up question on that. How do you say, because two key pillars that remain in a zero trust model is, one is context creation, because that's something that you have to contextualize it, and second is visibility. You need to keep and continual stuff. So any inputs on that? How does that get accumulated? Because if the context, if you're not losing the context, then you miss out what the zero trust is all about. Zero trust, the main thing which comes with it is learning the baselines and all that stuff. So is there a challenge in getting those as well from the start?
Yes. There will be, because you see, when you look at security as a technology function, context was never important until now. Because the moment you talk about zero trust, you are talking about something that is context based, that is metrics driven, and that is time bound, right? That is a fundamental shift in how enterprises have looked at technology and technology adoption. There is a cultural shift also that you're doing. Earlier, the users would ask IT, can I use a cloud system? Today, it is the other way around. The IT teams are probably asking the users, what do you say if we move you to the cloud?
Yeah.
So there is a paradigm shift that is happening, or rather, I would call it a fundamental shift that is happening in how you look at things. Earlier, for example, privilege access management. That is another area. If you really ask me, zero trust, privilege access management is an excellent example of zero trust, because you are now making sure that the super users who you trusted, who are your best resources, who are going to solve a problem when you actually need them to, you are trying to communicate to them that you don't trust them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, while you are trying to bring in that new system, you are also enforcing that culture of trust. So, context is everything. In fact, I have read somewhere, and I'm sure you're going to agree, context is the king. As long as people understand how this has to be done, which brings me to another point, to your earlier question. One of the key elements that we will need to do is establish that culture of zero trust
Yeah.
through a lot of awareness, hand holding, and bringing that basic thing in. The reality is, and the good news is, each of us are good at zero trust, very good at zero trust in our individual lives. I mean, and we've never seen it more until the COVID-19 happened, right? How much are you willing to trust that the guy you see across the table does not have the disease, and it doesn't put you at unease? And that's what I believe, we should be looking forward to. Uh, and making sure that these two aspects are never forgotten. Context is the king.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Agni. So Prakash, primarily, say when organization thinks, and just a follow up on your earlier question on tech stacks, how should, because the theme also of our session also is we have point solutions, and then how do we engineer into something on a zero trust. So there would definitely be some level of strategization on architectures, how the deployment architectures can be, what are the best practices, anything that you want to throw light on, what should be the right approach there, and if there are any threats or risks which are left on the table, and that's something which would be enlightened.
Sure. So I'll start with the basic. To start with, there are very four interesting architecture words which is defined in the NIST methodology. And considering this is a best practice meet, I thought I'll share this with everybody. To start with, identification, very simple parameter, probably very simple processes to follow, which probably many of us are already doing as a part of ISO or PCI, is first to identify, right? Have a proper inventory, set the baselines. The second is protect. Now, the protect when it comes to zero trust, earlier where the words what we use is authorization or authentication. But with zero trust coming in the picture, we are looking at the firmware level of hardware integrity checks, which has probably never been used till now, right? How many of us probably look at if your firewall firmwares are 100% accurate, hardware integrity checks? There are so many news in the past where a laptop had a firmware issue. Now, are we as a CISOs upgrading BIOS chips of 1,000 people? I don't know. That's something what zero trust covers now. Obviously, when it comes to detect, that's the third parameter, which is where a standard SOC methodology of detecting anomalies will come in the picture. And the last would be the respond. So which is more of containment and mitigation. Now, like Agni was sharing, micro segmentation is very, very crucial. Obviously, many companies will have a bigger challenge of legacy devices, right? How do you do zero trust network with legacy devices like ATM machines? You have ATMs running on Windows XP. You have old network switches, hardware, servers, which probably cannot be upgraded. There is a legacy with that. How do you do micro segmentation in that? And there is very interesting best practice which I have seen, which is software defined network perimeters. This is something which happens at layer 7 of OSI, which still is not being followed by many companies. That is something which has picked up a lot, which is the software defined network perimeter. That is one. When it comes to best practices, probably uh, keeping the keeping aligned to the theme of this meeting, we'll start with probably a Microsoft best practice. They have a pretty good document on how the zero trust can be started from the scratch. The second document, what we can refer to, is the NIST 800 standard. There's a pretty very interesting release by NIST in 2020. They published the draft called 800-207, which covers zero trust architecture very, very well, and they released a final copy very recently. And the last one is a very good practice document, which is released version 1 by DISA. The full name is Defense Information Systems Agency. This is by United States Department of Defense. That version 1 is prepared by the Zero Trust Engineering team of US Department of Defense. Probably very, very high level. I'm sure none of us work in military as of now, so it may not be require that level of granularity to protect defense network. But it's really good document which talks about device compliance, which talks about user analytics. It also talks about data rights management in a zero trust network, and also on macro and micro segmentation. So some of the best practices what I would probably share with this group would be the NIST 207 and the DISA standard from Department of Defense.
So Prakash, if in case there is a B2B, say one is enterprise, within enterprise you are coming up with the zero trust architecture for your own ecosystem. Other is in a B2B, for example, let's take any scenario of two organizations talking to each other, right? So where the zero trust actually takes the next level. You are not only trusting your authenticated stuff, you are trusting somebody else. So any experiences that you want to share on a B2B collaboration where use of zero trust can be implemented?
Uh, the typical segmentation what we do, that's the key here. The firewall port whitelisting, the IP address whitelisting, that's the key. And obviously the newer technologies of zero trust or having IPS, IDS being there, which is again this two companies B2B are talking on internet or probably a leased or MPLS line. So that technology should work there.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thanks. So Alvi, so back to you. Primarily, and let's take that zero trust is a journey that the organization decide. It's a complex journey. It's a time-consuming journey. It's an expensive journey, and we all agree there that it needs resources, it needs efforts, it needs management buy-in. At the same time, management also want to see how the success is depicted for this journey. How are we showing the value add? Can there be qualitative or quantitative metrics around it? Can there be anything that we can show out to the leadership, to the boards, saying, "Boss, this is the adoption of our zero trust journey, and this is how the success needs to be measured." Any views on that, sir?
There are multiple elements in how you measure success, but because it's a significant departure from traditional network architectures or traditional networks that work, the main play that we need to establish is that it is about applications. The complexity of allowing application access versus the ease of the end user to gain access is a key parameter. But validation of your ability to deter a security attack is the second parameter. Today there are multiple tools that do that, right? There are processes that you can do that, and the third parameter is the process itself. So if I take these three, there is a new development that is now happening in the area of processes, wherein you define how process handover will happen and how the information will be kept secure within that. So there are zero trust elements you can keep adding there. And for technology, there are tools that are available today, which include stuff like breach attack simulation, which look at validation of your closure of vulnerabilities that you did over a period of time. Red team attack, automated red team attacks, and stuff like this, which keep making sure that whatever you've invested in to bring in the zero trust are able to do the first part that I talked about, which is make you probably far more secure than what you were earlier. But there is an element of, there is a reality that you need to also find out, that is about the ease of the end user access. So if the ease of the end user to gain access to the applications that you want them to comes hand in hand with an improved security posture, which you can find out through those technologies and through changes in processes, then I think you've shown the proof of the pudding to the leadership.
Yeah, good point. So, Abhi, thanks for that. And yes, I agree, the continuous validation, because zero trust environment is such that you will have a lot of interconnected stuff, and you will, while you say no trust, always verify, the reliance is on verification, which is very important, that the validation.
That is why continuous validation. You have to keep validating for every single instance. You cannot say that, okay, Agni wants access to Rajesh's information. I know Agni, let him have access. No, every single request needs to be validated, which is where continuous validation is very, very important.
Absolutely. So that brings us to you, Andy. Primarily around this continuous validation, what's the Keysight's set of things that Keysight has been doing as part of the zero trust journey to give that assurance back to the clients that whatever architecture, whatever ecosystem controls, including the zero trust controls that have been enforced in, are working, and that can give the leaders as well as the security professionals a reasonable assurance that the zero trust model is actually meeting the objective what it is destined for.
Yeah, sure. So, at Keysight, we have a breach and attack simulation solution called Threat Simulator, and I think it fits into zero trust in two ways, really. I think there was talk earlier of how we take those first steps into the journey towards zero trust, and I think one of the most important things is for organizations to understand what their current security posture is. And what I mean by that is that an organization needs to kind of understand what threat actors are likely to be targeting them, and and based on that, they can move to to carry out an assessment. So some of the early stages, I do hear a lot of customers wishing to carry out risk assessments, which includes the likes of threat modeling in the early stages. And I think that's very prudent because as also mentioned earlier, we can take this step towards zero trust in small steps. We can do that. We can use legacy technology to take us part way there. But what we probably really don't want to do is to expose some of our kind of untrusted parts of the network. Trusted parts of the network to this kind of untrusted part now, if we're going to start changing the infrastructure. So I think it's really key at the beginning to carry out this risk assessment and threat modeling, and I think breach and attack simulation can help do that. So again, because we're talking about best practices, I'll just explain what breach and attack simulation is, I guess. So breach and attack simulation, it's relatively new technology. It was defined in 2017, I think, by Gartner. And essentially what it does is it gives organizations the ability to kind of evaluate their security posture. It gives that continual validation that you spoke of earlier, and that brings several things. It gives the ability to test the efficacy of security controls. Configuration issues have been an issue for a long time, and I think the complexity of zero trust will only contribute to those as well. So I think being able to find misconfiguration issues is really important, and then also that ability to detect, making sure that all your data sources are configured so that they're alerting the SOC team through your SIEM, for example. So that's all the kind of the value prop of having breach and attack simulation. And there are some really good use cases I could talk around. I think it probably helps to understand how this kind of technology is deployed. Essentially, the way that this technology works is an organization can deploy agents, lightweight agents on their network, and they would have them in different network segments, and then external to their network, you can host, or rather we host agents that perform all the malicious kind of activity. So these would be emulating command and control servers, or servers dishing up malware. So from that, of course, then you can imagine you can orchestrate some very complex scenarios. So you might have a scenario that starts off with a phishing email being received by a user. That user in this context is linked to one of our agents. And we're able to determine whether that email was received by that user. Did it land up in the inbox? And if it did, we can emulate the user clicking on the link, and then maybe some outbound connections to malicious hosts, downloading malicious content, and that then installing, and even lateral movement from one network segment to the other. And I think the advantage of this is that it can be done continuously, as you say. Continuous validation is the key to it, but also it's that element of safety as well, because we're not attacking your infrastructure as such. Of course, it's going through your security controls, but we're not actually attacking servers in your data center. We're attacking our own agents, so that makes it eminently safe to do that.
Yeah.
And because we know what we're sending and what we're receiving, we're able to determine what has been blocked and what hasn't. And if it has or hasn't been blocked, we can also then query the likes of your SIEM. So we can work out, has an attack been blocked? Has it then alerted your SIEM correctly? So you get a full holistic picture of where your security posture is, your ability to block. And then, of course, if you do this on a continual basis, you can see straight away if there's any misconfigurations, let's say, that's been adopted overnight. So you get to see them immediately, rather than when you contract some external pen testing services in 6 months' time.
Yeah. In fact,
so
that's add something. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. No, please.
No, I was trying to add something to what you were saying, and that is, the way I see a trend, there are organizations who are trying to move into continuous vulnerability management by putting tools that are continuously, looking at vulnerabilities and updating it. That's point number one. Point number two is, it is absolutely essential to understand what you just described in a lot of detail. In the Colonial Pipeline case, for example, and we all know that the ICS, industrial control systems, are yet to adopt these kind of capabilities. The CEO, I believe, at some point in time said that the VPN server, which was used to, attack the Colonial Pipeline system, did not come up in penetration tests. And that is where I believe, because it is agent based, the visibility of what you're trying to determine a weakness of becomes more apparent, and therefore it plays a much larger value.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very complementary to, breach and attack simulation doesn't, and it's not intended to replace pen testing, of course. I think it's one of those technologies that can be very, very complementary for exactly those examples you've given there.
Yeah. And one use case which comes to my mind before we wrap it up was primarily for organization which has to decide a way to the zero trust architecture or zero trust network. Breach attack simulation will actually show out where the weaknesses are, and then probably you can strategize your way of controls, whether you can do it on the existing infrastructure or probably you need to go for the next level of maturity. So maybe it can be a precursor to somebody who wants to know his readiness, whether they are going that path, and as well as the efficacy testing. Good point, sir. Thank you. So last question, Andy, before we wrap it up, we have hardly 2 minutes now. But the last question is, what is the OEM industry at large doing primarily to resolve some of those concerns of the industry? OEMs resolving concerns of industry. So anything on your roadmap as Keysight, or anything which you know of which would solve the problems around the zero trust implementations?
Yeah, sure. I can speak obviously from the Keysight perspective, and I think we've mentioned breach and attack simulation. Relatively new technology to achieve those aims. I think something else. We think we touched on it earlier in that. I think logging and monitoring is really important as well, and I think you can't either block or alert if you're not seeing that data, and I think that's a really important part of it. And as some of these implementations, maybe they're SASE implementations, getting visibility into that data and getting that data fed to the correct security tools or forensic tools, whatever it is you need them to, those kind of implementations can be maybe overlooked. So, not just kind of north-south traffic, but also east-west traffic as well. So, having that visibility into every part of your network, whether it's micro, macro, segmented, etc., as well, is also something that I see as quite key as well.
Perfect. So I'll take 30 seconds to summarize, and then probably we can see if Q&A, we have time for Q&A. You're almost at the verge of closure. So thank you, gentlemen. The few things which are key takeaways from this session is that the perimeters are gone, borderless implementation of controls. So the devices are the front-ending perimeters. Primarily either it's identity, or it's a device, or it's data, but it is no longer the boundaries which were existing at the organization level. So that's something which is no longer there. Second, this entire model works on that everything is compromised. The users are compromised, devices are compromised, infrastructure is compromised. So that's a pre-tenant that this particular framework assumes. And what do I control if that happens? So how do I verify? Third thing which also came up with, because this buzzword is, again, I changed my word. It's not a buzzword. So the word that's there as zero trust, it's a ray of hope primarily, yes, but it's a complex program. It's not something which one vendor or one partner or one solution can solve the problem. It's a journey that organization will have to take, and probably keeps measuring their assessments, do keep a validation of what sort of controls are being enforced, have those segmentations, micro segmentations, have granular level of controls that are required to be put in place, and be sure that whatever they have implemented is actually solving the problem of, and keep measuring it, because unnecessarily investing in and without a solution also may not be the right thing to do. And coming back to the last point of Andy on the breach attack simulation, it does help on continuous validation. It helps you to get visibility, and definitely key pillar of this would be visibility. We want to have visibility on what's happening. Context is very important. And point which Agni touched, the culture. Cost is definitely important, but end of the day, the culture. If the organization culture is, it's the most difficult thing to change. Human behavior is the most difficult thing to change. And this is not a technology solution. It also embeds some of that learnings from that. So great discussion, gentlemen. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for all your inputs. Any questions?
Thank you, Rajesh. We enjoyed too.
you.
Yeah, I think thank you so much, Mr. Rajesh, for beautifully summarizing the entire session. I would like to thank the panel for making it very exciting and insightful and educative as well. And apart from that, thank you so much for sparing out time and gracing us with your presence. I think we can conclude the session now. Next step is SecOps is data ops. Stay tuned for the next session, and we'll be starting shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.